Good evening to everybody. It's lovely to see faces that we know and some other faces that we don't know. So welcome to those online and those from Malta and those who are online from further afield. The Archaeological Society Malta and the Department of Classics and Archaeology are pleased to welcome you to this, our first series, first lecture in our series of talks for 2021-2022. I'm Patricia Camilleri, for those who don't know me, President of the Archaeological Society Malta, and I shall be mediating this evening's session. I'd like to ask you to mute yourselves so that we don't have off stage noises. I'd like to make it very clear that this talk is being recorded. The use of your own video is, of course, totally optional. As last year, we're really pleased that these lectures this year and next will be in collaboration with the Department of Classics and Archaeology at the University of Malta and the Archaeological Society Malta. Thanks, as always, go to Dr. John C. Betts, Head of Department, and to Professor Nicholas Vella, ASM Vice President, who is our link between the Society and the Department. Just a word about how we shall proceed from the evening. Many of you have followed our lectures last year, but just in case there's somebody who is totally new to us, I'll be introducing the guest speaker, Dr. Hugh S. Groucutt, then turning the virtual floor over to him. Please do ask your questions on the chat. You can write them during the talk, and then I shall be picking up on those questions, and I shall ask Hugh to answer some of them, depending on how much time we have at the end of the talk. This evening's lecture is entitled Putting the Stone Back in the Stone Age, New Research on the End of the Maltese Temple Period. So, we'll just move on. A quick word about our guest speaker. Dr. Hugh Groucutt is an archaeologist of prehistory, specializing in human evolution and the responses of human populations to environmental change. His work focuses on the Mediterranean basin and adjacent areas of Southwest Asia. With degrees in archaeology, that's a BA from the University of Sheffield, and paleoanthropology MSc from the University of Sheffield as well, and a PhD from the University of Oxford in archaeological science. He approaches these topics therefore with a highly interdisciplinary focus. After positions at Oxford, including a British Academy postdoctoral fellowship, he is now a Max Planck group leader in Germany, where he leads the Extreme Events Research Group. So, without further ado, over to you, Hugh.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, and for the invite to be here this evening. It's a shame we can't get together in person, but it's still great to have these online events. So I'm sure most of you here will be familiar with the Temple period of the Maltese Islands. For those of you who are not, let me set the scene a little. So the Temple period refers to a really fascinating period of the past, beginning a bit under 6,000 years ago and ending a bit after 4,000 years ago. It's most famously known for these remarkable megalithic structures like the one shown here at Hajar'im, which are often called temples. And a major kind of question in archaeology is why this long-lived culture came to an end. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. I think it's also important to remember that these remarkable structures were built by a society which had no kind of metal tools. They were entirely reliant on organic and stone technologies. So in the later part of my talk, I'll move towards looking at these stone technologies and how they can inform us in these sorts of debates. So what I'm talking about in the first half of this lecture are examples and kind of major themes drawn from a paper which will be coming out in a few weeks. It's available online as a preprint at the moment. And this is a paper with several co-authors, some of whom are here tonight. So if you want more information, you can find this paper online. So to pick up on some of the major kind of themes, look at that paper if you want to see the full references and so on. But when it comes to debates on the end of the Temple period, a variety of ideas have been expressed. So was there some kind of famine? Was there a disease outbreak? Was there a drought? Was there some kind of arrival of new groups of people? Was there kind of societal unrest? So some people, for example, talk about there being a kind of rebellion against an increasingly oppressive priesthood. And I think it's really a fascinating kind of story to examine these different ideas. Cross-cutting these different ideas are discussions on the kind of tempo of these changes. So, for example, people like Trump talked about the end of the Temple period as a kind of catastrophic, sudden collapse. But in recent years, there's been another school of thought which has argued for a more kind of gradual end to this period. And this is perhaps taken furthest by Sigona. So she, for example, argues that people turned their back on the old way of life because they had an economic alternative. So rather than a collapse, it's a conscious kind of change away from an old society. So in our paper, we review these kinds of ideas. We also look at the point which several authors have made, which is that the end of the Temple period coincides in time with something called the 4.2K event. I'll come back in a moment to what that is. But we use this as a kind of central hypothesis to test in our paper. Oops. So the 4.2K event is a very interesting phenomenon. Two proponents of this view, there was a global mega drought 4,200 years ago, 4.2 Ka. And this has been linked to various kind of major archaeological changes. So things like the collapse of the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, things like the end of the Old Kingdom in Egypt. And in these cases, there are environmental records which show kind of sharply increased aridity coinciding with these major changes. So as, for example, Weiss, who's a very strong proponent of this view, put it, in Mesopotamia, he believes there was a reduction in rainfall of up to about 50% in less than 5 years. And this caused the sudden collapse of the Akkadian Empire. These sorts of ideas, though, have also been challenged. Other people have said that these changes were actually more about kind of political and social changes within these societies. And I think even if we accept that in some cases, it's true that this kind of arid episode caused these societal collapses, it is clearly more complicated. So this map on the left shows environmental records from this period, 4.2 thousand years ago. The red dots show places where there's evidence for drier conditions, but blue dots actually show places when it got wetter at this time. So there isn't a kind of global homogeneous drought. Even around the Mediterranean, there's a lot of complexity. So for example, some places in the Balkans show wetter conditions at this time. In terms of archaeology and like societal responses, there's also a lot of variation. If we look, for example, at Crete, this is the kind of early Minoan period, and there's no evidence for a sudden collapse. This is a society actually becoming increasingly kind of complex. And I think, so even if in some areas there were these sudden collapses, it wasn't, again, a universal response. So I'm very interested in looking at the Maltese Islands and thinking about this idea that there was this perhaps major kind of climatic change at the end of the Temple period. And what's very interesting is that in recent years, there's been a lot of research in the Maltese Islands, which we can kind of relate to this time period. One example that I think is very interesting is about the presence of what in Malta is called thermeware. So this is a distinctive kind of pottery. You can see an example here with a very characteristic kind of thickened rim and often very distinctive decoration. And people have long recognized this kind of pottery in the Maltese Islands, but more recent work has added a lot of clarity on how it fits. So for example, it's now known from sites like Tastilj and Tachaula that it dates to the very end of the Temple period in the kind of 4.2, maybe 4.4 thousand year ago time range. And as more work has been done in the region, the kind of context of this pottery has become clear. And that is that it relates to a wider phenomenon, which is called the Cetina phenomenon, which is a spread of material culture from the Eastern Adriatic. And in Malta, this kind of pottery occurs in late Temple period assemblages in small numbers, but it's very distinctive. And interestingly, it's in Malta, it's made locally. And there are examples of kind of hybrid pottery, which combine this Thermi style with more kind of classic Tarshian phase forms. So I think this is a really important kind of area of research and seems to show a demographic connection between the Eastern Adriatic and the Maltese Islands. And there may have been other examples of these kind of connections, but this seems to be a particularly clear one. A point I would like to kind of get across is that in these sorts of discussions, it's very hard to tell the age of things. So, you know, I've been saying this happened about 4.4 thousand years ago, this about 4.2 thousand years ago. But it's really important to kind of recognize the challenges of talking about the timing of these events. So the main technique used in these periods is radiocarbon dating. And these images are, if you send a sample to the lab, this is the kind of thing they'll send you. So basically radiocarbon dating works because organic materials absorb something called radiocarbon-14 from the atmosphere, and this over time breaks down. It's unstable, and we can measure this breakdown. But the problem is that levels of radiocarbon-14 in the atmosphere vary over time. So we have to do what's called calibration when we convert radiocarbon ages to actual ages. Sometimes this is quite straightforward. So in the image on the left, the blue line, this is the calibration curve. So in this time period, there aren't big changes in atmospheric radiocarbon. So the red curve, this is the actual lab measurement, and then the gray curve is the actual age of the sample, the calibrated age. But if you look at the right, for example, if you have a radiocarbon date of about 2,200 years ago, so about when the Romans came to Malta, you can see the blue line has all these ups and downs and kind of plateaus, because at this time there were quite extreme changes in radiocarbon levels. So this makes it very difficult to tell the precise age of a sample in this period. So you can see the complex grey distribution. The actual age is somewhere within this over kind of several centuries. And while there have been very important advances in radiocarbon dating, these kind of uncertainties are very important, even for a single date, let alone when we try and combine dates or compare, for example, archaeological sequences and climate sequences. So this is something in my group that we've been trying to think about how we can be more precise when we look at the timing of past events. So in our paper on the end of the Temple period, we explore some examples of how we can think about chronology in a kind of more nuanced way. One example I think is really interesting is that there are several sites in the Maltese Islands that have statues which seem to be damaged or kind of defaced, perhaps at the end of the Temple period, but precise dating of them has been very difficult. So we explore perhaps the most interesting example of this, which is from the Shara Circle side. So a statue, you can see on the left a reconstruction of it, was deliberately smashed at some point at the end of the Temple period, and the parts scattered over a few square meters of the site. So we use this as a case study. And on the right, you can see, so vertically, each of these is a single radiocarbon date. And as you can see, many of these dates have these complex kind of distributions. So it's very hard to say when each date, when each sample exactly dates to. So what we've done here is collect all the radiocarbon dates for contexts in which fragments of this statue were found, and then construct different kind of chronological models to explore the timing. And then we compare these different models to the actual data and see which fits best. And what this is showing is the model that fits best. You can see the blue curves. These are the model start and end points for these contexts in which pieces of statue occur. And these suggest that this smashing of the statue occurred more than 4,400 years ago. So well before the 4.2K event. This obviously is a single example, but it does perhaps show this, this idea of this kind of ideological crisis. We find this very classic Temple period form being deliberately smashed, and that occurs, much earlier than the 4.2K event. So something that I think is very important to do over the coming years is to improve the record of past climate in Malta. So at the moment, we have quite a poor grasp on how climate changed in the past. The most common kind of record at the moment are sediment cores taken where valleys meet the sea. So they're kind of alluvial marine interface localities. These are shown as white dots here. And these records are really important, but they're also very complicated. This is just one example of kind of work done from these records. So a couple of points I'd like to emphasize. You can see on the left, so the second column from the left, these are the radiocarbon dates for the site. So at the bottom, there were 3 dates very close to each other. And then at the top, there are 2 dates that are actually inverted. So the date at the top is older than the one almost a meter beneath it. And this often is the problem with these kind of records, that they're formed by material moving down fluvial systems, so things get mixed up, and the resolution of the dating is just therefore quite poor. The main kind of work done on these records is then pollen analysis. So all these graphs you can see, they're showing different levels of pollen. And in theory, these changes in pollen reflect changing kind of vegetation, and changing vegetation perhaps reflects changing climate. So if you look at the right, you see these different colors. For example, dark green is trees. And if we accept the dating of this kind of sequence, this might suggest that we have these periods at the end of the 3rd millennium BC when there are not many trees around, perhaps because it's dry. But the other major problem with these records is that it's really not clear what changing pollen actually means. Does changing levels of tree pollen mean it's drier, or does it mean humans have cut down trees, for example? And actually, if you look at different records from these cores around Malta, they all seem to have quite different kinds of records. So they're perhaps reflecting more local kind of agriculture and landscape management, more than they are actual kind of climatic changes. So I think what would be nice in the future to do is have more robust local climate records, which would allow us to kind of compare the archaeological changes with climate. At the moment, they don't really exist. So what we did in our paper was instead to look at climate from Italy, which I think probably was similar to Malta. So this is a record of changing rainfall from a stalagmite in Italy. And we then compared that to available radiocarbon dates from Malta. So we're comparing to archaeological activity in Malta with regional climate. And in this case, we're looking at all the dates for the Shara Circle site as the most kind of well-dated site in the Maltese Islands. And this is using a new method called radiocarbon event count models that my postdoc Chris Carlton developed. And what the image on the left shows is basically the correlation between rainfall and archaeological activity in Malta. So the brighter colors and higher bars are where there's a kind of stronger correlation. So what you can see is that there's a peak in both rainfall and archaeological activity about 4,500 years ago. And this then declines. So we can see this kind of long-term relationship between human society in Malta and kind of regional climate. And again, I think it's interesting to note that this change occurs well before 4.2 thousand years ago. But from 4,500 years ago, there seems to be a decline in rainfall and a decline in activity in Malta. And we can also test this more quantitatively. So the graph on the right is a regression. And basically, it's all in the negative area. So it's this is showing when there's less rainfall in Malta, there's less rainfall in Italy, there's less archaeological activity in Malta. So I think using these kinds of chronological modeling approaches, we can say some quite interesting things about the Temple period and its end. But we also have to be careful. The old adage that correlation does not mean causation is always true. And I think, it's always the case that multiple societal and natural factors will be influencing these kind of processes. So I think we need to have a quite open mind about the kind of processes that may have been involved. I briefly mentioned at the start that one category of explanation for the end of the Temple period is a disease epidemic. And I think what's really interesting is that in the past few years, research across Europe has, perhaps for the first time, identified a possible candidate for this disease. And this is plague. We all know about plague from more recent periods of history, but actually recent genetic research has found evidence for plague in the Neolithic and Bronze Age in Europe. So on this map, these are showing sites with human skeletal material where Yersinia pestis bacteria, which causes plague, has been found. So first from about 5,000 years ago around the Baltic, and then further south over the coming centuries. And if we remember, for example, this evidence that there's a demographic connection between the Eastern Adriatic and Malta, it becomes, I think, quite possible that there was a spread of this plague to Malta. At the moment, there isn't any evidence because there's almost no published ancient DNA from the Maltese Islands, but I think it's quite possible that this played a role. Around this time in the mid-3rd millennium BC is also a time of sort of major demographic changes in Europe. So the fundamental point here is that there's a spread of what's often called steppe ancestry or Yamnaya ancestry. So people and genes from the East European steppes spread westwards. And when we come to look at the Mediterranean, there's not much ancient DNA to look at these kind of issues of plague and of these major demographic changes. But there, in the past couple of years, have been a series of studies which I think allow us to begin to recognize some of these kind of processes. So, for example, Lazaridis and colleagues published a paper in 2017 where they showed that people associated with the Minoan and Mycenaean cultures in southern Aegean were primarily of local Neolithic background, but had a small but significant element of this steppe ancestry. A more recent paper from northern Greece found that by about 4,500 years ago, people were about 50% of this steppe ancestry. Another really interesting study is not currently published, but it's available online as a preprint. In this study, the authors sampled the oldest known skeleton from the Balearic Islands about 4.4 thousand years ago and found that this individual, again, had a significant element of steppe ancestry. In Sicily, this team also found evidence that by about 4.2 thousand years ago, people have this steppe ancestry. In the case of Sicily, these authors also highlight some particular genetic features that otherwise are only known in Iberia. So they argue for this west to central Mediterranean migration. So we can look at these kind of findings and start to see this very dynamic kind of Mediterranean world with these long migrations and these populations mixing. But last year, a major paper was published on Sardinia, which shows a completely different narrative to what I've just been talking about. So in this paper, they sampled 70 individuals. So this is by far the largest sample of ancient DNA from the Mediterranean. And what this found was that there was no evidence for these major kind of demographic changes. In Sardinia, there's genetic continuity in the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, and it's only in the kind of first millennium BC with the Phoenician spread that there's a major change. So where does this leave Malta? I think it's quite unclear at the moment, and I think it's just interesting to highlight these different trajectories, different processes in different places in the Mediterranean. So now I'm going to start to move towards the second part of my talk about trying to put the stone back in the Stone Age. Many of these themes that I've just discussed, we can relate to discussions about sort of connectivity or isolation. So for example, we can talk about environmental change in the Maltese Islands, but the impacts of this really depend on the kind of societal settings. So if, for example, people in the Maltese Islands were very closely connected to people in Sicily, then perhaps people would have just emigrated if there was a kind of drought. But if people in Malta and Sicily were very separated, this is perhaps less likely. So I think cross-cutting all of these kind of themes is this issue of how isolated or connected were the Maltese Islands. And this feeds into a sort of long history of discussion in archaeology about island archaeology, about whether, as people like Evans and many others have argued, islands are these sort of unique natural laboratories where they're cut off and isolated, and cultural processes are more extreme. Or as people like Rob in a 2001 paper argued, actually there were much more intense connections than perhaps have been suggested. So Rob's paper, I think, is whatever you think of his ideas, is a really important paper, a very thought-provoking paper. And he argues that in the Temple period, these close interactions with Sicily were necessary for human existence in Malta. And for example, in the map on the right, he's suggesting that if you look at travel time, so both maritime and on-land travel, that actually much of southeast Sicily was closer to the Maltese Islands than it was to other parts of Sicily. And other people have also made arguments that relate to this. So Chatsim Palaglu, who I'll come back to soon, he suggested that the evidence for the import of chert into Malta suggests this kind of constant seafaring activity. So Rob talks about many categories of evidence which he suggests show these intimate connections. He says people brought things like timber from Sicily. Obviously things like wood and other organic materials very rarely preserve. So what we're really talking about here in terms of evidence we can look at today are preservable materials, so basically different types of stone. So, for example, it's widely known that obsidian was imported into in the Maltese Islands in prehistory from Pantelleria and Lipari. Rob also suggested that ochre, so very brightly coloured iron oxides, often used as kind of paints, he suggested that a lot of this was imported from Sicily. We'll come back to that. Chert, for example, was imported from both Sicily and mainland Italy. And what we can call axe stone, so very hard stones ground down to make axe forms, was imported both from Sicily, but also as far north as the Alps. So one perspective on these kind of findings are that Malta is extremely connected both to Sicily and to the wider kind of region. And this, if this is true, this close connection will obviously have had an impact on the end of the Temple period. But I think there are some major caveats here. Firstly, the Maltese archaeological record often has a very distinctive kind of local character. So for example, the temples of the Temple period are only found in Malta. And this does suggest perhaps a kind of unique local record by a kind of isolated society. But even if we look at its very tangible aspects, so these imported materials, I think we can see quite different perspectives. So for example, it's true that obsidian was imported, but actually if you look at the form obsidian occurs in sites in Malta, it's typically as very small flakes, as chips and fragments, which to me suggests primarily a kind of intense curation and reworking of a small number of objects that were imported. In a study by Attard Montalto and colleagues just under a decade ago, they studied various iron oxide deposits in the Maltese Islands and found actually that these were consistent with the Maltese archaeological sites. So it seems that ochre actually wasn't imported, that it was locally sourced. A very interesting example concerns what are often called axe pendants. So these are part of a wider category of material culture, which are called groundstone axes. And in the Neolithic world, these were a very common kind of functional tool. But in Malta, they're quite peculiar. They're very small, so often kind of 1 or 2 centimeters, and they're often pierced at one end, sometimes 2 ends. So they're seen as being pendants. And to me, this again is very interesting. I imagine these actually begin life as functional kind of tools. They're worn down through use, they're resharpened, they're rejuvenated, and they become part of the symbolic realm. And to me, you know, this becoming symbolic is itself showing that these items were exotic, they were rare and unusual. So my interpretation of this kind of record actually is that we could be looking at quite occasional imports. It could be a ship, you know, washing up in a storm every few decades, bringing a few axes, a few pieces of obsidian and so on. I'm not saying that necessarily is the case, but I think it's quite possible. So what I've been interested in doing recently is looking at the evidence of chert to think about these debates. So chert is the most common kind of rock used for stone tools in the Maltese Islands. So chert is a sedimentary rock with high levels of silicon dioxide, but this silicon dioxide occurs in different forms. So in very high quality chert, it's often as quartz. So you can see at the top right, this is a kind of idealized quartz crystal. And quartz is a very hard material and very crystalline. So with this kind of rock, you can fracture it between the crystals and then have very sharp edged, but also hard edged kind of tools. And by looking at how people acquired chert and then produced stone tools, we can learn a lot, not just about this issue of connectivity, but also about various themes of behavior and how these societies operated, how they shaped wood, how they butchered animals and so on. So here I've tried to compile various studies that people have done on these chert lithics from the Maltese Islands. On the one hand, this is cumulatively quite a large kind of body of analyses, but many of these studies are not just about these chert lithics. There'll be general kind of papers about a site, and they'll include a kind of small section on lithics. But with the work of people like Clive Vella, there is an interesting kind of body of literature on these chert lithics, but I think a lot more can be done. And you can see here some examples. These are drawings of how some of these chert lithics look. And I just want to make a few kind of points. These have generally been studied from a very typological perspective, not a technological one. And what this basically means is in typology, the idea is to divide an assemblage into different categories, whereas a more technological approach is more about the processes involved in production. And people often suggest that particular types have very obvious kind of functional uses. So you find a kind of pointy rock, and this must be a spear tip. But actually, you know, globally, people have done lots of work looking at the residues on stone tools, looking at micro wear, and actually there's a kind of poor correlation between the shape of stone tools and what they were used for. So we really can't assume functions based on the kind of overall shape of these stone tools. A very common form in Malta are what people have called scrapers. So the top three here are these things often called scrapers, and these have been described by Malone and colleagues as the ubiquitous tool of the Temple period. I'll come back to this point later. In terms of the wider kind of production processes of how people shaped cores, so cores are the nodules of rock, and then produce these flakes, there's not much work done, but people tend to suggest that it's all quite kind of expedient and simple. But I think we really need to do kind of detailed studies to look at this. An interesting point is that these lithic assemblages are very different from those in Sicily at the same time. And you know, why is that? I think that's something which again is needs to be looked at in the future. So I have another paper which is currently in review, looking at some of these issues of Maltese chert. So you can find a preprint of that online. So people often discuss, albeit in quite brief terms, the kind of quality of Maltese chert. The general view expressed is that Maltese chert is very poor quality, but others have suggested that it's kind of medium quality. And interestingly, Trump argued that actually it was very good quality. But no one has previously done kind of experiments with this kind of material to explore what this quality actually means. And in general, the idea of quality is quite complicated, because good quality in terms of making tools is a different thing from good quality in terms of using these tools. The work of Petros Chatzimpalaglu was important here because he studied the kind of chemistry of Maltese cherts, and he found that the form of silicon dioxide was typically not quartz, so not this kind of hard crystalline form, but actually was things like opal, which is a much softer kind of semi-crystalline form. And this explains some of the characteristics. And in his PhD work, Chatzimpalaglu looked at two localities, so Duera in Audesh and Homeré in Malta. And even though there were only two localities, at Duera he found a previously totally unknown kind of chert, a white, translucent kind of high quality chert. So I think there is probably more diversity in chert than has previously been recognized. And many studies will look at chert and say if it's local or imported, but it's really not obvious what is local and what is imported. So Chatzimpalaglu and colleagues often talk about three different groups of chert found in Maltese sites. So the one on the right at the bottom is material they suggest is imported from places like Sicily. In the middle is material they say is local, so both on its macroscopic forms and kind of geochemically. But on the left is what they call group one, and this often is the most common kind of chert at Maltese sites, and it's unclear where it comes from. So they suggest it probably comes from Sicily, but actually no sources kind of matched it. And I wonder if actually this kind of chert is from the Maltese Islands, and it's just that at the moment we don't have a good understanding of the diversity of chert here. So over the last couple of years, I've been doing survey work to try and look at this Maltese chert. So as far as we know, chert only occurs in the middle Globigerina formation, which is shown in orange on this map. but it doesn't occur everywhere where there's middle globigerina. So you can see these crosses. These are some of the places where there are middle globigerina outcrops, but there's no chert. So we're really talking here about the west coast of Malta. So if we zoom in here, you can see this strip of orange extending down the coast. This is the middle globigerina. Here are some place names so you can orientate yourselves. So previous work has suggested that chert was found at Thomirir, but what I found was actually that I surveyed along the west coast and I found chert outcrops along the entire west coast. So past places like Midr el-Ferha, Ras el-Dawara, extensive chert outcrops that have not previously been published. And these continued as far south as I could go before there's a very large cliff and a very small path. So it got a bit difficult. But the point here is I found chert over several kilometers of this coast where it was previously unknown. And just to kind of show you visually how this sort of looks, this is Thomirir. So you can see here the complete sequence of the geology of the Maltese Islands. And chert occurs in the middle globigerina formation. A little further south, same thing. This chert is not a kind of continuous layer, it's episodic, but it occurs at a consistent position within the sequence. And while I found a lot of chert outcrops, it's also important to note that actually it may be even more extensive. Some areas have lots of blue clay and upper coralline material covering these slopes, so they may be burying some outcrops. And as shown on the right, there's a lot of terracing, which again may conceal even more outcrops. This is how these some of these chert outcrops look. So quite varied in terms of color and consistency. Here are some more examples. And these are just quite abundant along the west coast. And while they're abundant, they're often quite small outcrops, but there are some particular features which sometimes make them more obvious. So these are what I call towers. They're basically where the chert is harder than the underlying rock. So it preserves these sort of tower-like forms. And once you have your eye in for them, they're very distinctive landscape features showing where chert is. And likewise at Thomirir, this is a photo from on the beach. There's a chert outcrop directly on the beach. And you know, Thomirir is the one of the few good sort of anchoring points on the west coast. So I just find it very interesting that for people who might have been arriving, there's chert kind of immediately visible in the landscape. I also found chert to be more varied than has been suggested. So as I briefly mentioned, recent work at Douera found kind of chert that was previously unknown. And I found yet another kind of form, this quite translucent material. If a small flake of this was found on a site today, it would probably be classified as imported, but it's not, it is of a local source. So again, there's more diversity in this chert than I think has been suggested before. So what I then did was collected some samples of these different cherts and did some experimental, what's called napping. So napping is making stone tools to explore the kind of characteristics of this rock. So these are some of the flakes I made. And actually I found this is quite a nice material to work with. It naps quite easily. So you can easily make flakes and these blades, kind of elongated forms. But what's interesting is that the edges of this material are not very sharp and they do break very easily. So if you try and use these flakes, they snap very easily. And explored a few different kind of methods of making these stone tools. So for example, what's called the Levallois technique, this was a very important way of making stone tools used by early humans, where you basically shape a core with a series of small removals so that you can then remove a large flake of a kind of predetermined shape. And you can do this with Maltese chert. So I just think it was quite interesting to point this out, that, you know, it's possible to use these different methods of stone tool production. So I'll leave it there for now. So just to kind of summarize, in terms of the end of the Temple period, we can make these various correlations. So for example, we can talk about regional climate change having this correlation with archaeological activity in Malta. But, you know, it is true that correlation does not mean causation, and that there probably were multiple kind of factors involved. And I know it's a kind of eternal refrain of the archaeologist, but, you know, we do need more work. But I think I'm optimistic here. I think work in recent years has added a huge amount. And particularly looking at kind of non-temple sites, non-ritual sites, I think will be very informative. I then try to link these kind of debates to stone tool technologies and how these can provide insights into connectivity and isolation. And I found that chert was more widely distributed than had been known. And so more work is needed on chert as a material in itself here, but also then we need to do comparisons of these Maltese assemblages with other assemblages. And by doing these mapping experiments, I made a few observations, or we could say hypotheses, on how the characteristics of this rock influences what was then made with it. So for example, as I said, the edges of these flakes break very easily. So one thing you can do is make a series of small removals to basically reduce the angle of these edges. And these, if found, would often be called scrapers, but I don't think it's about a kind of function at all. I think it's about a way of making stronger edges by just reducing the angle. And I think these are the kinds of ideas we need to explore if we're going to kind of really robustly understand the cultural aspects. So thank you all for listening, and thank you to various colleagues who have helped me by discussing these issues, and my daughter Frida for helping me with the fieldwork. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Groucutt, Hugh, for that. It really was a very interesting discussion, lots of, for me, new ideas. It's always interesting to see how new technologies are helping so much with, for example, the more nuanced carbon dating and other things, but how important also walking the land is. And you've demonstrated a very good use of both of them in that. Just my own sort of reflections a little bit on what you were saying. It's I love the idea of the obsidian arriving sort of almost by chance rather than coming in on from an expedition to Lipari. And I particularly like the idea that it starts off as one thing and ends up as something else. I think that's a really, really wonderful way of looking at a piece of, at an object, that it can be one thing at one point in its life and another, and an important sort of exotic image in another way. I'd better pass on to a couple of questions here. Keith Buhajar is asking, on the climatic data slide, what was the estimated average rainfall in millimeters at the peak of the Temple period?
I'm not sure exactly. No, I don't think anyone has really estimated it precisely. And I think there is a, I mean, the fact that some sites preserve much more kind of rich soils do suggest that it was wetter. But I don't think anyone's actually put a precise kind of number on it. So yeah, I mean, some people would use like pollen data to kind of estimate that, but as I kind of said, it's very hard to know what kind of pollen means. So yeah, sorry, I don't think anyone knows at the moment.
Something to discover in the future. Joshua Mikhailov is asking, is there no evidence of connections with North Africa when it comes to trade or migration at this time?
Yeah, good question. In a sense, no, but there are some kind of hints. So, for example, obsidian from Pantelleria, as well as coming to Malta, also went to North Africa. So if we think about the idea of kind of nodes on a network, you know, there are hints of Malta and North Africa being somehow connected. And I know there is, from the Fraxis project, there's kind of currently unpublished suggestions that there's skeletal material from the Shara Circle suggesting the presence of African people. There's a forthcoming volume. I'm not sure, you know, on the details of this. So there are these kind of suggestions, but in terms of what's published, there's nothing really, but yeah, strong hints.
Something else to look forward to. Carmen is asking, how can you estimate rainfall in Malta with reference to Italy? Is that reliable?
Yeah, I mean, it's not ideal. It would be better to have local records, but given that they don't exist, and you know, the dominant kind of weather system in Malta are these, you know, the northwesterly, the Mistral system, which is the same kind of weather system which takes water to Italy. So these are kind of central Italian speleothems. So I think it's probably reasonable. But again, it's something, it would be desirable to have directly local records, because it could be that there's some other kind of complicating factors. So for example, you get kind of high pressure coming off North Africa, which could change things. So my feeling is it's probably reasonable, but it's very much a hypothesis, and that we do need good kind of local records to really test that.
Great. Before asking this question or reading this comment, it was lovely to see this the work of you mentioning the work of Dr. Petros Chachimpologlu, because of course he gave us a lecture last year, so we feel we've heard it here, which is great. Nikki Bianchi is just asking about the chert nodules. Sorry, they're present in he says in Maltese clay deposits. You refer to imported chert. How much evidence is there for use of local chert, really, in comparison to imported? Yeah.
So there isn't chert in the clay deposits, but you do find gypsum. So you get these crystals in the clay, but it's actually gypsum, not chert. So you can't use this to make stone tools. And as I sort of alluded to, it's often very challenging to say if material is imported or local. But you know, at a minimum, there is extensive evidence for the use of local chert. My point is, it might actually be kind of overwhelming, you know, because I think the chert that we currently don't have a good source for could be local. Even if it's not, there is a lot of local chert. So, you know, every site that's been excavated, there's a lot of this local Maltese chert, which is interesting because, you know, people often say how bad the quality is, but people kept using it. So, you know, they found ways to use it, which I think it's a very interesting kind of story.
Yeah. Dawn is asking, were the concomitant lithic assemblages of Sicily more technologically advanced, in inverted commas, than Malta? How do they differ?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I would like to kind of, research more. And I think particularly for kind of southeastern Sicily, the record there is not very well understood. But yes, broadly, things in Sicily are more advanced. So more kind of blade forms, and then other kind of things which are called backed forms and kind of sickle forms. So yes, broadly we could say they're more kind of advanced. Then the question is, why is that? And is it because you can't make these things with Maltese chert? Some of these more advanced forms, or is it because of some kind of cultural difference? So that's why I think to address that question, we have to kind of start with understanding the Maltese chert, what you kind of can and can't do. So I think some of the more advanced things in Sicily may reflect just like harder rock and higher quality raw material, but no one's really compared these areas systematically. So that's something that needs to be done.
Great, more work for you. More research. I don't have any more questions on the chat, but I just like perhaps to discuss a little bit this wonderful idea of there not being no or little correlation between form and function. It's such a lovely idea that you could have an object, and this is linked as well to this idea of the obsidian being used then in other ways, that you have an object that looks as though it should be something, but in actual fact, it may well be that we're looking at it with our eyes and not with the eyes of the people who made it. I mean, I find that sort of philosophically very sort of interesting.
Yeah. I mean, there's a kind of classic comment by Francois Borde, who was one of the kind of pioneering French archaeologists, and he had a very complex typology, and in which he had point and convergent scrapers. And someone said, well, how can you tell the difference? He said, if you can kill a bear with it, it's a point. And this is, all these classifications are things that modern archaeologists have invented. And often it's useful for us to kind of classify things into different groups. But actually, we have a very poor grasp of what these tools were used for. We can talk about cutting and scraping and so on, but yeah, to me, it's a very interesting point that actually, and it's now very well established kind of globally that there is a very poor correlation between the form and the function. But there's a lot of research. People look at the kind of organic residues or microscopic kind of wear. And it's, an area which is really interesting. And, something else that we need to do in Malta is really look at kind of traces of what these tools were used for.
Yeah, I love that idea. Well, plenty of thank yous on the chat. Everyone has found your lecture very interesting indeed. I'd like to thank everybody for participating in this evening's event. We look forward to seeing everybody again on Wednesday, 17th November, when Tony Burgess, guest lecturer in maritime archaeology at the University of Malta, will present Flying High in an Unfriendly Sky, How Aviation Changed Malta for Good During the Second World War, which is an intriguing title. I urge you all these lovely 70 people who are on the online today, to all become members, if you're not already, of the Archaeological Society Malta through our website. It's quite easy. And the website is www.archsoc.org.mt. And in that way, you really will be supporting the society in its lecture program, its peer-reviewed journal, the Malta Archaeological Review. The latest issue, of course, I'd like to tell you, is number 12, and it's now taking shape online, and anybody can access that from our website. And you would be also helping very much in its advocacy work in support of all things archaeological in Malta. So sincere thanks from the Archaeological Society Malta and the Department of Classics and Archaeology at the university to Dr. Groucutt for really a really illuminating talk tonight. The ASM looks forward to seeing you all again at our next lecture. Do follow us on Facebook and on our website. And thank you all so very much. And good night.